Να ξεκινήσουμε σιγά σιγά. Καλώς ορίσατε στο πρόγραμμα σεμινάριων της Ελληνικής Κοινότητας Μελβούνης. Τα σεμινάρια αυτά αφορούν την ελληνική ιστορία και τον ελληνικό πολιτισμό. Good evening and welcome to today's Greek History and Culture Seminar brought to you by the Greek community of Melbourne and Victoria. My name is Spiridoula Dimitriou and I'm here to introduce Dr. Christos Fifis, whose topic tonight is the Greek Australian community from 1900 to 1954. I would like to commence by acknowledging that the Kulin nations are the traditional custodians of the land upon which we have gathered tonight. I pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The kind sponsor of tonight's seminar is the Ethiopian Philanthropic Society. We thank the Society profusely and acknowledge the work it does, not only in the field of philanthropy, but also in the sphere of culture and education. Dr. Christos Fifis is a leading Greek Australian historian, translator and educator based in Melbourne. He arrived in this country in 1965 and received his MA from Melbourne University in 1982 and his PhD from La Trobe University in 2009. His thesis is titled Navigating Through the Generations, A History of the Greek Orthodox Community, 1897 to 2008. Dr. Fifis has been teaching Greek studies at RMIT, Victoria College, University of Melbourne, La Trobe and Monash universities for many decades. He has devoted more than 50 years to supporting and initiating the establishment of Greek translation services and historical documentation. He is currently an honorary research associate at the La Trobe University. His research interests include the history and literature of the Greek Australian community, and he has published articles, monographs, and a volume of essays on the subject. His book titled The Greek Australian Issues, Articles and Discussions was awarded first prize in the 2019 book competition in the category of History and Social Issues, which was organised by the Greek Australian Cultural League of Melbourne. Those of us who have studied modern Greek at tertiary level here in Melbourne would be familiar with his book of poems by the Greek Australian poet Ninos Ninoulakis, who is among Dr. Fifis' many publications and collections of poetry and short stories. In 2021, Dr. Fifis published a theatrical play, Το σπίτι της Βασίλος, Vasilos' Home, based on Greek Australian historical and social migration experiences. More recently, Dr. Fifis has written a series of very informative articles on the genesis and episodes of the Greek War of Independence. Dr. Fifis is also a prominent advocate for social and community services, a broadcaster for the Greek Australian media, and has been a volunteer broadcaster for the Melbourne Multicultural Radio 3ZZZ program for over 30 years. The history of the Greek Australian community is the story of how our ancestors put down roots in this country. Tonight, Dr. Fifis will concentrate on the development of the community in the era between 1900 and 1954. Within this time frame, there were also social and political tensions as community organisations and institutions became established. Among other things that Dr. Fifis will elaborate on tonight are the factors that shaped the Greek Australian community during this time. So I now ask you to put your hands together to welcome Dr. Fifis to the podium.
Thank you, Spiridoula. I would also like to pay respects to the traditional owners of Melbourne, the Kulin Nation, and to their elders past and present. I aim in this presentation to highlight the major events, issues, and developments in the history of the Greek-Australian community between 1900 and 1954. It is a lunch topic, and I won't be able to discuss all aspects, but I will be happy to discuss issues further at the end, answering questions in English or in Greek. Why 1900 to 1954? I could have started in 1895. After 1895, the Greek communities of Melbourne and Sydney began to stabilize as some women migrated also to Australia, and we have a number of families and social and cultural life. In general, in 1901, the number of Greek women in Australia was very small. It was small throughout the period, even up to 1954. According to Charles Price, in 1901, the ratio was 100 Greek women to 1,207 Greek men. And in 1947, the ratio was still 100 women to 287 men. The organized community began in the 1890s with the existence of a number of families and the creation of the first Greek Orthodox communities of Melbourne in 1897 and Sydney in 1898, and the founding of their churches. We can see in this diagram the censuses of 1901, 1911, 1921, 1933, 1947, and 1954. We might observe a large increase between 1947 and 1954. We need to clarify the difference between community and community. Community with a small c means the larger community, the parikia. I'm talking about parikia. Community with a capital C is the organization. The Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria is the organization with a capital C. 1954 also is an important turning point as it marks the end of the old pre-war Greek community and the beginning of the new mass migration community. And in table 1, this is table 1, as we can see how the community increased over the decades, and we are using as a basis the censuses up to 1954. We can discern in the history of the Greek-Australian community landmarks and periods. Such landmarks are the years 1897-98, 1912, 1916, 1924, 1933, 1954. We discern periods such as 1895 to 1916, 1916 to 1940, 1940 to 1954. The period 1897 to 1916. In this period, we have the beginning of the organized Greek life, the establishment of many Greek shops in the major Australian cities. The creation of Greek shops brought chain migration, mainly men from Kythera, Ithaca, and Castellorizo. The Greek communities of this early period contributed to the strengthening of the Greek defense through fundraisings, especially in the years 1912-13 with the Balkan Wars. And 1913 marks the establishment of the first Greek newspaper in Australia, Australia, which was published in Melbourne. 1916, it's a landmark year. Why 1916, in various respects, is an important milestone in the evolution of Greek-Australian community. We have information from 3 different sources about 1916. First, we have the publication of the book Life in Australia. Life in Australia is this book, which was published for the first time in 1916. It was the first book, the first Greek book published in Australia. It is the first book. And after many years, after 93 years, it was reprinted in 1992 and also was translated into English and published also in 1892 after 93 years. This is the English translation. Secondly, in 1916, we have a secret census of the Australian Greeks ordered by the Commonwealth government, a secret census for all Greeks of Australia. And in 1916, a third source, we have also a report in the form of a letter by John Stakmidgis about the situation of Greeks of Sydney. Let's examine the details of this information. The secret census. Because of World War I, many Australians expressed sentiments against Greeks and Greek shops. They considered Greeks as friends of Germany because of King Constantine's pro-German attitude. The Federal Security Service ordered a secret census of the Greeks in Australia, of their occupations, their ideological sympathies, and thanks to this census, published by Gilchrist in his book in 1897, we now, we know the key elements of the 1916 Greek community that complement those of the book Life in Australia. According to Hugh Gilchrist, within a few weeks, without attracting attention or suspicion, the secret census was completed. Of the 2,398 Greek people and their business in Australia who were recorded by the police in their secret census, only 7 were considered pro-German, and only 2 had previous convictions, and, only 2 had previous convictions, and these convictions were for gambling. The rest were peaceful residents who had never attracted police attention. The authors of Life in Australia, who wrote it in Greek in 1915, were unaware of the secret census and reported nothing about the violence against Greek shops in Brisbane and Sydney in 1915, and Perth and Kalgoorlie in 1916. The book is written from the perspective of successful businessmen and does not discuss the difficult lives of Greek workers as assistants in their employer's business. The book describes the conditions for doing business in Australia. praising the hard work and honest work of Greek businessmen and the Greek entrepreneurial spirit. Its authors cite biographies, photos, and descriptions of the commercial achievements of some 155 Greek businessmen in various Australian cities and country towns. Among the key players, a major mention is given to the financial sponsor of the book, John DiComino, a native of Kythera, who owned a luxury oyster restaurant in Sydney. He also owned a chain of other restaurants and other sites, and he is described as the richest Greek in Australia in 1916. He was a lifelong honorary president of the Greek Orthodox community of Sydney, to which he had donated the plot to build the first Greek church in Australia, the Holy Trinity, in 1898. He is presented in the book as patriarchal figure of Greek businessmen in New South Wales. The patriarchal figure of Greek businessmen in Victoria is presented in the person of Antonis Lekatsas or Anthony Lucas. Anthony Lucas was the son of a priest from Exogee, Ithaca. He was born in October 1862 and emigrated to Melbourne late in 1886. He owned 3 luxury restaurants in downtown Melbourne and many other assets. He was a long-serving president of the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria, and in 1916 was the wealthiest Greek in Victoria. He was described in the book as an all breadwinner and a great entrepreneur of today, of 1916. 10 years later, Antonis Lekatsas was Australia's richest Greek. He was appointed Honorary Consul General of Greece in Sydney from 1923 to 1926. In 1931, he was appointed Honorary Consul of Greece in Melbourne and held this post until his death in August 1946. He was generous in aiding charitable causes, Melbourne hospitals, and he created a hospital in Ithaca. In 1943, he donated £5,000 to Winston Churchill for the victims of the recent German bombings in London, and $5,000 to the then exiled Greek government for the starving children of Greece. In Adelaide, South Australia, the patriarchal figure of Greek businessmen was Dimitrios of Constantinople, who ran his business in partnership with his sister-in-law, Athina Konstantinidou. In Perth, Western Australia, the patriarchal figure of Greek businessmen was the tobacco manufacturer Petro Michelidis. He was born in Castellorizo in 1882 and emigrated to Perth in 1904. In 1916, Michelidis was appointed Honorary Consul of Russia and France. In 1923, he was the first elected president of the Greek Orthodox community of Perth and Western Australia, and later was appointed Honorary Consul of Greece in Perth. Most of the other businessmen in life in Australia in 1916 were relatively young. They were bachelors, averaging 28 to 30 years of age, and averaging about 10 to 12 years in Australia. So there were people who came to Australia after 1900. They ran restaurants, cafes, hotels, pastry shops, grocery stores, fish shop, fish and chips of old English style, serving fried fish with fried potatoes, or American style milk bar, grocery and pastry shops. The authors are making great effort to inform young businessmen to develop a proper attitude in their dealings with Australians and Australia. Cleanliness is emphasized in the book, and the reader is informed that there is a hefty fine of £20 at that time for adulteration of milk with water. Νερώνανε το γάλα και τότε. These relatively young entrepreneurs came from Kythera, Ithaca, and Castelloriza. About 43% of the Greek immigrants of the period, and almost until 1947, came from these three islands. Most Kytherians lived in New South Wales. Most Ithacans lived in Melbourne, and most Castellorisians in Perth. The majority of the businessmen presented in the book came from Kythera and had their stores in Sydney and in various other New South Wales towns. All the business people presented in the book were men, except Athena Konstantinidou in Adelaide and Margaret Wilson in Melbourne, who was the English wife of Antonios Lekatsas. The book presents these entrepreneurs as children of poverty. Most of them came to Australia with high and sacred aims. In other words, to do well in business. The book highlights success through perseverance and honest work and pride in their Greek ancestry. These Greek businessmen, according to the book, started poor from a very low level and are proud of their not elegant but honest work. Many of them, although they had only recently arrived, abandoned their shops and took the 35-day return journey to join the Greek army during the Balkan Wars of 1912-13. The authors claim that more than 500 new immigrants returned to Greece in 1912-13 to join the Greek army. This is certainly an exaggerated number, because only 25 are listed in the list of those names that returned to Greece, including John Tamvakis, who fell in the Battle of Kilkis. These young businessmen were also the people who contributed generously to the national fundraisings during the Balkan Wars. The book informs the reader that there were 630 Greek shops in Australia in 1916. At that time, about half of them in Sydney and Melbourne, some in Perth, Brisbane and Adelaide, and the rest in various smaller towns. These stores included 4 coffee houses, kafenεία, across Australia. Greek kafenεία in the pre-mass immigration were places of meeting places of bachelor immigrants, but also contained many of them, some of them, contained illegal gambling rooms unknown to unsuspected strangers. The authors inform us that in 1916 there were 170 Greek families in Australia, 170 Greek families, 2/3 of whom both spouses were Greeks, and 1/3 were of mixed marriages. Families in urban areas were scattered throughout the large metropolitan area, making it difficult to set up a Greek afternoon school. It was a problem. Therefore, the authors expressed their regret that many young Greeks lacked knowledge of the Greek language in 1916. Australians are described in the book as civilized, friendly, and to a certain degree gluttonous, with a fondness for sweets and fruits, which ruins their teeth, something that makes the country's dentist very heavy. The book also mentions other occupations of Greek settlers. There were some hawking traders, peddlers, fishmongers, and fish shop owners. There are references to the two priests of Father Dimitrios Marinakis of Sydney and Archimandrite Daniel Maravellis of Melbourne, the retired Father Seraphim Fokas from Sydney, and the Melbourne medical doctor Konstantin Kyriazopoulos, who was the first medical doctor in Melbourne. However, there is no mention of the Archimandrite Germanos Iliou, and the creation by him of the first Greek afternoon school in Perth in 1915. Nor is there a reference to a young medical student in Sydney, George Takmidjis, who was to play some role in 1916. While the book was published in 1916, its writing seems to have begun much earlier. George Kendavros, it had been written by George Kendavros, a Corinthian, and Kosmas and Damianos Andronikos, Cytherians, and their prologue date back to April 1915, which means the book was written even earlier. This may be one of the reasons for not reporting the attack of soldiers and others on Greek shops in Brisbane and Sydney in 1915, or in Perth, Kalgoorlie and Boulder in Western Australia in 1916, when Greeks were targeted because of King Constantine's alleged pro-German feelings. The writers certainly did not know about the secret census of the Greeks in June 1916, but did not even discuss the class differences, the harsh working conditions of Greek assistant workers who worked in Greek shops at least 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for their stay, board, and some meager earnings. They do, however, make some reference to the Greeks working in the sugarcane plantations in tropical North Queensland, in cutting sugarcane, a job to which some Greeks began recently working at. Hugh Gilchrist, however, makes a mention of George Takmidjis, a 22-year-old medical student at Sydney University, who in April 1916 wrote a letter to King Constantine explaining the tragic conditions of workers in Greek shops in Australia. He paints a different picture to that picture of η ζωή in Australia, a different ζωή in Australia. He writes to King Constantine, the Greek population here may be divided into three groups: the working class, the rich, and those who rule. The workers, unfortunate people, are condemned by fate, forced by the other two classes to work many hours a day in hard labor for low wages worse off even than the helots of Sparta. And because of this overload, they often fall ill. He was a medical student, visiting the hospitals, I see people with hernias, kidney displacements, general debility, even venereal disease. Why? Because they have no one to advise them about their rights and about a proper lifestyle. The rich Greeks, exploiting the situation, receive a good income because of this justice against the poor. Tachmiges asked the king to appoint him as a Greek consul in Sydney to make the Greek name beloved, respected, and admired. The letter is, Tachmiges' letter is even more important than the radical views of a student because it was accompanied by the signatures of 168 Greeks of Sydney. In a way, Tachmiges, who later became a doctor in Sydney, acted as a representative of Sydney's poor and unhappy Greeks who had been overlooked by the authors of Life in Australia. Tachmiges, in his letter also, accuses Sydney community priest Father Dimitrios Marinakis of laziness in the performance of his duties, that he is primarily concerned with making money and flattering the rich. The rich are his collaborators and his relatives. Contrast the other picture about Father Marinakis, presented in the book Life in Australia. The authors of Life in Australia write about Marinakis. One of the most modest, good, and widely learned members of the clergy of the Greek Orthodox Church abroad. The Reverend Father Dimitrios Marinakis is the parish priest of the Greek Orthodox Church of Sydney and was born in Arachata, Asia Minor. His inestimable talents have been justly honored by the Greeks of the Church in Sydney, who so greatly respect and love him. At any rate, Father Marinakis remained in his position until 1923, when the Sydney community asked the Greek Holy Synod to replace him. Despite protests, Father Marinakis was replaced, but he did not leave Sydney. He abandoned the priesthood and with his brother bought the Sydney Greek newspaper Australia. It was the newspaper Australia which first was published in Melbourne, but then it had gone to Sydney, and Father Marinakis with his brother bought Australia, renamed it National Tribune Ethniko Vima, which was circulating till recently, if I remember well, and they published it weekly in Sydney. The book Life in Australia in 1916 was printed in 10,000 copies, at a time when the Greek population of Australia was much less than 4,000. Copies were sent to Greece and America. It seems to have been intended to inform people outside Australia of the conditions of making business in Australia, to inform the Greek government of the progress of Australian Hellenism, and while in Greek, to convince the Australian authorities of the law-abiding Greeks and their progressive spirit. Let's see some of these people. he was John D. Comino, was financed the book Greeks in Australia, and he was the richest Greek in Australia at the time. That's one of Comino's oyster saloons. He had a chain of such shops. It's Anthony Lucas. It's the Melbourne Antonios Lekatsas. So this is one of Antonios Lekatsas shops, Town Hall Cafe. It was just opposite the Melbourne Town Hall on the other side. Look what happened. Now, in this photo, it's an interesting one. It's Constantine Mavrocephalos Blake. The little girl there was, if you remember her, Nina Blake. Nina Blake, the sister of Olga Blake. You might know Olga Blake. Mavrocephalos was the fourth president of the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria. That was in 1917. Sorry, 1917, yeah, 1917 was Nina born. Yeah, probably it was 1988, the photo. Also, we might say that Konstantinos Mavrocephalos was one of the Greeks who went to Greece in 1912-13 to join the Greek army. That's what happened. Now, he's Dr. George Takmidjis. Of course, here it's not in 1916, it's much later. He had a history much later, Dr. George Takmidjis. This is a theatrical group of Greek women in Melbourne in 1917. They staged a play by Dr. Kyriazopoulos. He wrote a theatrical play, and they staged it in 1917. Apparently, all of these ladies were his clients because he was a doctor. You know, there was the only doctor in Melbourne, the only Greek doctor in Melbourne. Dimitrios Politis and Athena Konstantinidou in Andalai. He's the soldier who went to Greece in 1912-13, and he was killed in the Battle of Kilkis. Here's the doctor, Konstantinos Kyriazopoulos, the first medical practitioner, Greek medical practitioner in Melbourne. The first Greek priest in Melbourne. He's Seraphim Fokas, the first priest in Sydney. He had, I think, 6 daughters. There were not very many women, so many important business buried his daughters. And one of them was who was the first one? Comino. is this priest. We have talked about him. He is Father Marinakis, who left, abandoned the priesthood and became a journalist. And Ireneos Kasimatis was a priest in Melbourne from 1921 till 1924. We'll talk about him a little later. Now, 1916 to 1940, we have expansion, economic crisis, and recovery. We can go back here. So, which one we used to go back? Yeah, from there. Between 1916 and 1940, the Greek community of Australia increased in numbers. After 1923, the arrival of refugees from Asia Minor also brought some women. This somewhat lessened the shortage of Greek women in the community. The great economic crisis that began in 1929 exacerbated unemployment, misery, and class inequality. The Greek settlers were represented by the communities and the few fraternities and organizations that were also facing financial difficulties. The small increase of Greek population had helped, but not enough, to make community organizations, churches, schools, and newspapers, Greek newspapers, economically viable and independent. The influx of Asia Minor refugees after 1923 contributed to the creation of new families. In an article in a Melbourne newspaper, the Greek language newspaper, Ethniki Salpika, National Bangle, on July 4, 1923, Archimadrati Ireneos Kasimatis remarked that the typical Greek families in Melbourne were newly married couples or older families whose children were past school age. According to Michalis Tsounis, at least 8,000 Greeks arrived in Australia in the 1920s, but many departed. Over 40% of Greeks left Australia before World War II, after staying and seeking their fortune for a few years. This increase in the Greek community was not always welcomed by some segments of the whole society, as shown by the Ferry Report in the state of Queensland in 1925. The Ferry Report states that socially and economically, this type of immigrant, the Greek immigrant, is applying to the society in which he settles, and it would be better for the state if his entry was completely forbidden. 1925. Of course, this kind of prejudice thrives on ignorance and misunderstanding. And we have church and communities dispute in the 1920s. In 1903, the ecclesiastical leadership of Australian Hellenism was transferred from the Patriarchate of Jerusalem to the Church of Greece, and in 1924 to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which established the Australian Orthodox Diocese of Australia, with Christopher Knitis as the first Metropolitan. In July 1924, Knitis arrived in Australia. This change caused, for the next 4 years, a fierce conflict between the new diocese and certain community leaders for a variety of reasons. Knitis clashed with the Archimandrites Ireneos Kasimatis in Melbourne and Athinagoras Varaklas in Sydney, whom he dismissed. In Melbourne, the community administration at that time was held by the majority of the Samians, but in Sydney, the community there, which were Cytherians, banned Knitis from entering the Holy Trinity, which was a community church. Knitis' friends built for him a new church in Hagia Sophia in Sydney. Metropolitan Knitis was recalled in April 1926, but reinstated after representations of his friends. Eventually, he was recalled again in February 1928. In 1932, Dimitrios Evangelinidis was appointed Metropolitan, and in 1947, Theophylactos Papathanassopoulos. Dimitrios and Theophylactos realized that the metropolis would find it difficult to cope without the cooperation of the communities, and up to 1958, there was generally cooperation between the metropolis and the communities. Facing the economic crisis of the 1920s and 1930s, the Melbourne community since 1924 had economic difficulties to maintain the functions of its church. In 1927, it faced bankruptcy, and evangelismos could not pay for the priests. And the community was reorganized in April 1928. Class division in the Greek community continued throughout the pre-1940 period. After 1929, there was the great economic crisis that plagued the industrialized Western countries in recession and unemployment. In the Greek-Australian community, the crisis affected both individual and community organizations, and the poor suffered greatly. We have this diagram here, which is the census of 1933. We have the number of Greek men and women in every state, and we can see that the total of Greeks in Australia in 1933 were 8,337. According to the census of 1933, 18% of the Greeks in Australia were employees, 25% self-employed, and the rest workers. 33% were unemployed, and 6% underemployed. They live on a few hours. They worked only a few hours. Australian unemployment at the time was 25.5, but for the Greeks it was 33%. Furthermore, 79% earned less than £3 per week, which was just the salary of a worker, £3 per week. 79 earned less. 40% earned only £1 per week or less, and 70% were not Australian citizens. Michael Tsounis presents data of the Greek Church in Adelaide between 1925 and 1940 at the Greek funerals. The average age of people dying in Greek funerals in this period, 1925 to 1940, was 41 years. 41 years, 20 years less than the Australian average. The innovation by Tavlaridis. However, the crisis was not the same for everyone. Many entrepreneurs lost their business and employees lost their jobs. Many who were unable to pay their debt payments lost their homes, and others were evicted. However, there were some who, using innovation, did quite well. Effie Alexakis and Leonard Yanisevsky refer to Joachim Tavlaridis In November 1932, Tavlaridis, who was also known as Mick Adams, opened in 24 Martin Place in Sydney a new type of shop, the black and white 4-pence milk bar, the first American-style milk bar in Australia, selling to standing customers milkshakes. He was Mick Adams, the first businessman who brought milkshakes to Australia, milkshakes and soda drinks. Thousands other followed, opening in Australia American-style milk bars, most of them Greek, for the next 4 years. Between 1916 and 1940, despite the financial difficulties, many regional associations, fraternities, and other political and sports organizations were created in the Greek Australian community that reflected its expansion and diversity. To the old associations of Ithacans, the Orpheus, the Castellorisians, the Cytherians, new ones were added: Macedonians, Samians, Asia Minors, Cypriots, and others. In 1935, the Democritus Workers' League was created in Melbourne, a largely left-wing organization aimed at becoming the political and cultural association of Greek workers in Melbourne and Victoria. It was followed by the Atlas in Sydney in 1939, and later by similar organizations in 2 or 3 other Australian cities. The Greek left in the pre-1940 community were not numerous, but active in trade unions and community life. These organizations did not represent the expatriates of a particular geographical region or a particular political party, but aimed to address the political and cultural needs of the Wider labor movement, and so to attract members from the working class and small business of the community. They maintained links with other Australian working groups and trade unions, and sought with their newsletters and their political and cultural activities to provide lonely and isolated workers with language assistance, alternative entertainment opportunities, political information, and advice for avoiding gambling. They also provided workers with information about Australia and the rights at their workplaces. These workers' associations supported the activities of the communities concerning churches and the afternoon school, but were against the exploitation of workers. This brought them into conflict with Greek employers. The writer Alekos Doukas, in his novel Under Foreign Skies, presents the experiences and feelings of Stratis, the main character of his novel, for his employer, for his exploitation by him, while he was desperately trying to keep his job at his employer's shop in the early 1930s. Doukas, in the same novel, refers to an anonymous Greek trade unionist who tried to organize restaurant workers in Sydney and attracted the hostility of the Greek employers, who reported him to the police as a troublemaker and anarchist. The police were constantly monitoring his movements, never arresting or interrogating him to break his nerves. The unionist was led to suicide. Dimitris Kalomiris, a Greek-Australian journalist, in an interview in 1989, confirmed that the trade unionist referred to by Doukas was a real person. Doukas' anonymous trade unionist was Andreas Raftopoulos, a migrant unionist from Ithaca who committed suicide in Sydney in 1941. Raftopoulos' wife and two children lived in Greece. Towards the end of the 1930s, Raftopoulos became an organizer of the Restaurant Workers' Union and was also a founding member of the Sydney Atlas Association in 1939. The case of Andreas Raftopoulos shows that intra-community class tensions of the period. Andreas Raftopoulos and George Mitsopoulos were members of the Communist Party of Australia, which at that time was illegal. Mitsopoulos was accused of distributing leaflets against the war, convicted, and was interned at a concentration camp together with German and Italian fascist internees. After Alexander Grivas and officials of the Greek consulate testified against him, against Mitsopoulos. In Melbourne, members of the Democritus in 1939 buried the Greek Consul General Vrizakis, Metaxas, and King George II in the Orpheus Hall at an event for the name day of King George II. This triggered a long-standing communal split in Melbourne between right-wing conservatives and the left that continued for many decades, almost, we might say, until 1981. Much of the structure of the Greek community in Australia had already been formed by 1940. The communities, the metropolis, the consulates, the newspapers, the afternoon community schools, one in each major city, regional fraternities, cultural, sports, and political organizations had already been created by the 1930s. Only three of the various, at times, Greek language newspapers survived and managed to survive in the 1930s, two of them in Sydney and one in Melbourne, and these newspapers continued till the 1950s, and much later, of course, Panaginios Sirikas is still circulating. 1940 to 1950, the war years and the early post-war community. The war years after 1940, with about 1 million American soldiers passing through Australia between 1942 and 1945, the Australian economy accelerated, and so did the food industry, cafes, restaurants, milk bars, etc. The Greek businessmen did very well during the war years. They also contributed to changing Australia. The milk bars and the cafes contributed to changing Australia from a British-type eating shops to American-style shops, and changing the British with the American eating culture, because so many Americans passed through Australia. In the second part of 1940s, due to the shortage of ships, due to the previous war, there was no significant migration from Greece to Australia. The main move was the reunification of families with their members who had been cut off during the war in Greece. In the 1947 census, Greek immigrants to Australia amounted to 12,291. Certainly, they would have been a little more if the census had included persons of second generation, Greek Cypriots, and Greek immigrants from other countries. Let's see some of the photos now. it's the Archimandrite Maravelis. He was a priest in Melbourne. Marinakis, Irenaeus Kasimatis. Now, this is a wedding of 1925. 1925. We see. Oh, sorry, that's not. Yeah. It's a wedding of in Melbourne, 1925. We see here the Metropolitan Christoforos Kinitis, and behind is the priest at the Evangelismos at the time, Dimopoulos, Christoforos Dimopoulos, from the period of 1925. Now, this is the interior of black and white full milk bar at the Martin Place, Sydney, of Mick Young's American-style milk bar. The first one introduced in Australia, which introduced milkshakes. He did very well. Actually, the first day it was opened, they served 5,000 customers in one day, and 27,000 customers in a week. So they did very well, and many others followed, of course. That was in 1932. 1932. This is the Greek community. Well, the Greek Community School. It wasn't the Greek Community School, it was the Greek School in Melbourne in 1931. We see there is the priest Christoforos Dimopoulos, and also the teacher. He was an ex-president of the community, and he died in 1933, if I remember well. He was killed by a car while he was going to teach, to see a child, a student of his. And the Greek community buried him with honorary. Yes, that was in at the time. You have seen this photo. It's 1948. Greek school at Evangelismos in 1948. You might see one of the teachers was Stathis Raftopoulos. You remember Stathis Raftopoulos? And the next one is Nina Black. Remember Nina Black, baby? Now he was a teacher at school. And on the other side is the legendary teacher Alexandra Vrachnas, just on the other end, and students at that time. And this is an excursion of members of Demokritos during the early 1940s. Kiki Tsouni was the first Greek woman who had become a member of the Council of Demokritos and the Secretary of Demokritos in 1942. So this might be circa 1943. So, mass migration after 1953. In 1952, a migration agreement was discussed between Australia and Greece, and in 1953, the two countries exchanged ambassadors. Mass immigration began immediately. In table 1, sorry, can we go up again? Yeah, we'll go back. That one will be. Yeah. that's the table 1. We have the various Australian censuses. We can see that in 1941 there were, we have more women now, but not very many. In 1947 there were all persons, 12,291. And in the next census in 1954, they had become 25,862, and the number of men 16,000, and the number of women 9,068. Differences between the pre-war and the post-1953 immigration. The largest migration from Greece to Australia occurred between 1952 and 1971. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in 1947, the number of Greece-born residents of Australia was 12,291. In 1954, it was 35,862. In 1961, there were 77,333. And in 1977, they reached 160,200, the highest point. The community infrastructure, communities, churches, schools, organizations, and fraternities formed before the war now went through a period of dramatic expansion after 1954. The young immigrants who left Greece for economic reasons, unlike the pre-war workers working in Greek small enterprises, had to work as industrial workers, mainly in Melbourne, Sydney, and Adelaide. However, there were also many who left for political reasons, due to persecution and discrimination. And there were others who left for social reasons, men who otherwise could not have a family if their sisters were not married beforehand, or young women who, due to lack of dowry, could not find prospective husbands. Many of these young women were forced by circumstances to emigrate with the so-called ships of brides to Australia in order to marry their partners in arranged marriages. Most of the Greek immigrants of the period were from agricultural villages without any technical or vocational training and had little knowledge of English. They knew nothing about Australia and the Australian system. They were usually young men and women from the Greek countryside, often feeling lonely in a foreign country. The Sydney National Tribune, the Ethnico Vima, of March 25, 1953, hosted statements by the newly appointed first Greek ambassador to Australia, Dimitrios Lambros, who, apparently echoing Greek official policy, spoke of large-scale immigration on the basis of a plan. The problem, as it turned out, was that there was an official migration plan, exportation of excess people, but no plan or concern for the problems that would encounter. The largest number of new immigrants settled in Melbourne. The intentions of most Greek migrants were to return home after 5 to 8 years. Of the pre-war immigrants, around 37%, and those of the mass migration, around 34%, returned, when the children were still young, as the phrase used to be at the time. The majority, however, found it difficult. 1954 then marks a dividing line between the older and the new Greek community parikia. The structure of the institutions was formed during the pre-war years, but the large parikia was formed after 1954. Mass immigration radically changed the occupation structure of the pre-war community. According to Price, in 1947, 58% of Greek-born in Australia were employers, 58%, more than what they were in 1933. Or employers or in the categories of employers or self-employed. 43% of Greeks lived outside the major capital centers, in towns, in the Australian countryside where their shops were located, or worked in the shops of their compatriots. A well-known phrase in Australian country towns at the time was, "We will meet at the Greek cafes." In 1971, at the census of 1971, in a community more than 13 times larger than that of 1947, the percentage of employers and self-employed was only 17%. The rest were industrial workers and employees. Only 7% of the members of the Greek community lived in 1971 outside the larger capital city centers. So we can notice a totally different picture between the pre-1947 and the post-1954 Greek-Australian community. Thanks very much for listening. Sorry for the
Thank you, Dr. Fifis. I must admit, the longer the talk went on, the more emotionally moving I found it. Because I mean, for me, I wasn't aware of the extent of the inter-class conflict in the 1930s, so that's something I learned. But also, I was surprised by the ratio of mixed marriages to Greek marriages early on. And the topic of repatriation is an interesting one too. And I wasn't aware that people, even in the 1920s, were coming and leaving quite...
It was much unemployment at the time, so they had to leave.
They had to leave.
Yeah, they couldn't.
So it wasn't because they'd become successful and they were ready to go. So I'll, who would like to start?
Thank you for a wonderful talk, Fifi. Appreciate it, especially as Ithacans. We very much enjoy this period. It was interesting you mentioned about 43% were rural Greeks, and I presume 57 were...
43% living in rural areas in Australia.
Is that more Sydney or New South Wales based or Victorian, or is just a combination?
Well,
do you have it a split by any chance?
Yeah, I don't have the particular states, but overall in Australia, there were 43% living in country towns.
Right. Because I know there was a lot in the New South Wales. I just
in
wonder...
New South Wales is more than in Victoria, I think, but also in Victoria. There are places. Everywhere you can go, in every little town, there was a Greek cafe. And,
that's right. I'd love to get the actual figures between the states when you have them later. I won't press you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
Thank you, Chris, for a wonderful presentation. It would be interesting to do some research regarding how many Greek workers were members of unions. According to Charles Price, in the beginning, in the 50s and the 40s, the unions were refusing membership to migrants because they were seeing them as coming to Australia to take Australian workers' jobs.
Yeah, probably they were not that many, but the left were members of the unions, and Dimitrios was providing facilities for
Yeah,
for
that's right.
workers to
In
become.
1990, I interviewed George Zangalis and George Philopoulos.
Oh, yeah, well, Zangalis came in 1950. It was much.
Yeah, in the
before,
50s.
yeah,
He was the
yeah,
secretary of Demokritos,
yeah.
and Philopoulos was on the committee, and
But,
they said to me that
Demokritos was established in 1935.
35, that's right,
Yeah.
but until
And,
1950 when they came.
Andreas Raftopoulos
Yeah.
was a union organizer.
Union organizer, yes.
1940.
Yes, but according to Charles Price, they were still refusing
Oh, yeah.
migrants membership, and Zangalis and Philopoulos told me that the union was not approaching them, so they approached the unions to go to Demokritos and speak to the Greek workers, and that's how they established a communication channel with the Australian unions, and the unionists at the time had the vision to understand that the Greeks, were trying to be on their side, not really to take the jobs of the Australian workers.
Well, I remember in about 1973, 74, I think, George Zangalis organized the Greek workers, migrant workers, and
Convention, yeah.
and a meeting about with unions, and the unions didn't take it very seriously. But Zangalis told them that
Yeah,
they should
so
take it
even
more
though it
seriously.
was 1970s, still the unions were not taking them seriously, that's right.
1974.
So we'd be interested to do some research to see how many members they had, how many actually...
Oh, 1974, I suppose they had many more.
No, in the 50s and 60s when the mass immigration was happening.
1950s, there were not
Yeah.
few, of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Another question, perhaps? Theo?
Well done, Christos. That was a very interesting talk. But I'm just wondering whether or not there's any statistics regarding the breakdown of the origin of early Greek migrants. For example, in the 20s and 30s, there was quite a few Greeks that came from the area of northern Epirus.
Oh, yes, they did. They did
Now,
from Macedonia.
were they considered Greek citizens back then? So would those people, for example, be in the census that you're talking about there as Greek citizens?
1980s, you mean, yeah.
Because there's quite a large community that came from northern Epirus in the 20s, 30s and 40s, which back then northern Epirus was
northern Epirus,
was Albania.
yeah.
So I'm just wondering whether or not they would appear in the statistics of that census.
Probably there were not that many because you might look at, if you look at the statistics of people coming from Albania, they still, they were much fewer than...
And may I add, if I'm not mistaken, apart in the 20s, 30s and up to the 40s, apart from the islanders, the Ithacans, the Casteloresians, the predominant proportion of Greeks, the rest of the Greeks that came were probably from northern Greece,
Yes.
Florina,
they came from
Kastoria,
Macedonia, yes.
and probably, as I said, Voriepro. How do you
You
explain?
see
How do you explain
about
that?
43% came from the three islands. 43%.
Yeah.
So it's a larger population, about 57%.
But
Now, throughout
if
the
we
period-
specifically refer to Florina and Florina Kastoria in the 20s and 30s, there was a huge amount of people that came, and a lot of them went to West Australia. There's a large Greek Macedonian and Macedonian community in West Australia. How do you explain what was the reason behind that specific migration from that period, from that area there? And also from the rest of Kozani, for example, Tsitas came in the 30s, Agakidis came in the 30s. How do you explain that specific movement of migration to Australia back then?
Well, things in Greece also were difficult at the time. And people who were traveling around, like Tsitas, he went to Persia before coming to Melbourne. So they were trying to
Yes, but
find...
Cetus had people that invited him. He had others that came from his villages to here. So obviously they had a base here, and I think his objective was always to come to Australia.
It was a chain migration.
Yeah.
Chain migration. Someone was coming and bringing over his brother or parents, wife, and so on. And people came during the 1930s while their families were big. The Tsitas family came after 1947.
His children came after.
Yeah, the children and his wife.
And his wife, yes.
Yeah, Elefandis family came after 1947. these were the people who was a reunification after the war, and it was taking a long time to come. Citas, I think it took about 6 months or so, you know, and what was Alexander Kalivas came that time, I think, and took about 6 months, she told me, because they had to stay in Egypt till find a ship, find a seat in a ship going to Australia, waiting for it. Sorry.
Yes, he came from Persia, that's right, yes, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, his family. Yeah, but they came after 1947. Yeah. Yeah, and they had to, yeah. That was Stavrotsidas. Yeah, but his family came after 1947. Nondas and John, yeah, and their mother. Yeah.
And just one more question, Christos, if you don't mind me. What was the first time that the organised communities of the major states got together? When did they first feel the need to meet? For example, Greek community of Melbourne, Greek community of Sydney, Greek community of Adelaide. What information have you got in regards to the first gathering that those organisations formally might have had?
The Greek Orthodox community organised the celebration of the Greek National Day in 1917.
I'm talking about when the states got together to work together.
Oh, that was, it was unofficial, but in 1948 they had in Melbourne, they had a conference, a Synedrio in Melbourne, and most communities sent representatives.
So 1948 is the first instance that you're aware of?
Yeah, 1948 was the first official one. And the one after that was in 1958, when the dispute between church and communities started in 1958. After that, the Synedrio, after that conference, which was in Sydney, while in 1948 it was in Melbourne.
Do you know if the workers' clubs got together before 1948?
Workers' club, if you mean a club or clubs?
The workers' clubs, I'm talking about the specific state workers, for example, Dimitrios Lambros, did they have gatherings before 1948? So you're aware of any of that sort of thing?
I think it was some. George might know better than me in that. Democritus had a lunch meeting, you know, in around 1946, but I don't know if they had interstate visitors. Yeah.
Dr. Fifis, thanks for your talk this evening. It's very interesting. I might just add that I talk. My name is Dimitrios Lambros.
Dimitrios.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I
did you have any?
didn't know that bit of history, frankly.
Do you come from Ithaca?
Illuminating. I'm from Ithaca.
You come from Ithaca.
My father, yeah, I was born in Melbourne.
Did you know Andreas Raftopoulos at all?
No, not at all.
Yeah,
It came as a surprise today.
There are many Raftopoulos.
Yeah, my name. I didn't realise he was such a powerful union organiser, whatever his role was. But I just want to touch on a couple of other points you made. And I'm not sure whether people here tonight sort of realise the background to the why the early Greek migrants were. Sorry, why the early Greek migrants were predominantly Ithacan or from the Ionian Islands, from the Tanisa, because those islands were, basically colonised by the British between 1807, 1809 to 1864. Eventually joined the newly formed Kingdom of Greece. That was a connection. I think the knowledge of British colonial activity and in the diaspora
And also,
caused them to do that. My own grandfather, came to Melbourne and eventually ended up in the Western Australian goldfields in actually Boulder, which is basically a suburb of Kalgoorlie these days.
In the 1890s, was it?
Yes, my grandfather came in 1900 and eventually went back to Ithaca in 1905. Did quite well, went back and settled on the island, and made his little fortune and bought property there and set the family up. And eventually my father came here in 1922 and set up the traditional, cafe businesses and so on, like his compatriots. But the first recorded Ithacan arrived in Melbourne about 1851 during the gold rush. George Buxinos, and also followed later by
Andreas Lekatsas.
Andreas Lekatsas was A.J.J. Lucas's uncle, who I think came here in the, I think he came in during the gold rush period, but returned to Ithaca in the 1870s, prior to the birth of Antonius and his brother Marinos, who came here, also very successful in theatre industry. And as you mentioned, Antonius married Margaret Wilson, an Australian lady, and again, you could see the numbers there. There was a shortage of females.
She was an English lady.
Yes, she was Australian. Her father,
in Australia.
Her father, Robert Wilson, was an auctioneer. He was involved in real estate in Melbourne. And it's interesting how Lucas became involved in a different style of hospitality in Melbourne, whereas his compatriots set up a typical, very simple cafe which served steak and eggs and roast beef and
he was spending
anybody
much
could cook that, and and my father did the same. He was chief cook and bottle washer, as they say, and so it was a very simple business to set up. It's interesting that Lekatsas, though, ended up in high-end dining in Melbourne and was in the vanguard of that sort of business, because, and I suspect his wife was an influence there, because his wife, she worked in those days, but she was the manageress of the fur department of the department store Foy and Gibson. And my theory is that she rubbed shoulders or was catering to the wealthy, dowager type women, old money in Melbourne, who were probably part of the squattocracy. In other words, the early people that settled, the Western District and became graziers and had amassed quite a lot of money. They were old money at the end of the 1880s, when there was a boom, speculative boom in real estate in Melbourne. That all folded. There was a crash in 1893. Now, interestingly, that was when Lucas set up the Town Hall Cafe.
Oh, that was after that, because
after the crash.
He has said that 1993 was the worst time.
It was.
He lost everything apart from 9 shillings.
Yeah,
that's what he said.
He set up a business which was quite substantial. He'd been in other businesses before, between 1886 and 1894, and made a bit of money there. Apparently he lost money when the banks collapsed, but how he then raised the money to set up a restaurant in the middle of the city in Swanston Street that catered for up to 600 or 700 patrons at any one time.
Yeah, but it wasn't done overnight, though. It took many years. And also, he was a very good businessman in the sense that
he was.
He had the Vienna restaurant in Collins Street. At Collins Street, he had the Vienna restaurant, which was a very good one, but in 1916, because of the war, they were against the Austrians and against Vienna. And he changed the name, Vienna restaurant, to Australia Hotel. If you remember Australia Hotel? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. That was clever on his behalf, that, that move.
My theory, it's just my own personal theory, is why did that man get into that sort of catering business, whereas all the colleagues, all his compatriots rather, including my father, went in a simple steak and eggs cafe. And I think it was influenced, the Australian influence.
Probably, yeah, but yeah.
I think his father-in-law probably had finance contacts, raised money,
Yeah.
money, and I think that was a winning combination. Plus, during the Depression, he chose to cater to the upper class, the people, the old money people, the land speculators had made fortunes and lost them. So they went, and the everyday patron didn't have money anymore.
Well, you see that not everyone was doing well in business. Konstantinos Raftopoulos, Nina's father, he was doing quite well initially. And then, and then, probably, but in the 1930s he went to Ithaca, and he came back after 5 or 6 years. And then he changed to various venues, and he was doing worse of what he was doing previously, and he died, I think, in 1943, just a broken man.
We've got another 2 questions, 3, so... That's all I did.
Χριστό, θερμές ευχαριστίες. Listening to you has always been a joy, and your commitment in exploring the Greek migrant experience in Australia is, in my opinion, phenomenal and a source of inspiration. I'll begin with my question and I will qualify it. Can we find any kind of inspiration in the early history of the Greek communities in Australia as bearers of this history? For example, if the picture George Takhmidis draws about the ethos of the Greek community, which is more or less the same as the picture Alekos Doukas gives us under foreign skies, then is there anything to be proud of, basically, about this kind of history?
I think we should be proud. Why not?
Let me qualify it.
Yeah.
I've been recently involved in a history project. My partner and myself, in cooperation with the Greek Workers' Atlas League in Sydney, we've been trying to write the history of the organization. And as you mentioned, the Greek Workers' Atlas League was established in 1939. But the political, if you like, process for establishing the organization begins in 1924. So we are trying to cover a 100-year history. And in order to fully understand what was going on, we have gone back to the 1890s. And we have detected traces of trade union activities by Greek migrants. Okay. But as Takhmidis points out, and he's correct, he's very correct.
Yeah, he was.
The Greeks were known, as Tunis proposes, as the shop owners. But the evidence also shows that the Greeks were known throughout Australia as also being the slave owners. Okay? Because many Greek shops, especially the more powerful ones, were in a sense engaged for a very long time in illegal, deeply illegal, working labor activities. And the evidence is rather shocking from within the community and from outside the community. The behavior of the Greek leaders, the owners of the newspapers, the leaders of the Greek church, it's just shocking. They would never recognize the problem. They would appoint themselves as unofficial agents of the secret services. We came across a letter by Bizanis, the editor of National Tribune, 1932. He sent it direct to the Prime Minister, and he said, we have Bolsheviks, and if you want a list, let me know. I can do the job for you. You see? And there are many, many examples, very tragic examples. And of course, the most tragic one is what happened with Andreas Raftopoulos. The whole Greek community turned against him. I mean, the leaders of the Greek community, not everyone. By the way, recently we discovered his grave in Sydney through the Atlas Workers' League. So it was very moving. So my question is there much to be proud of in this kind of history, apart from the very brave attempts of Greeks to redefine themselves through trade union activities, through the Greek Workers' Leagues, not as foreigners, hated foreigners, but as responsible citizens that truly wanted to redefine what it means to be an Australian citizen?
George, if we are going to be proud or not, depends, it's a subjective matter. See, you can't say, some people might say, no, I disagree with that. And you have the right to have a different view. Well, it could be on the collective level. To the fact that many Greeks did well in business, it's something that could give pride to Greeks. The fact that they were slave owners, that's the negative thing. It's for the historians to work this out and discuss it. And I hope that's what we're aiming to do all the time. Yes.
Chris, thank you for a very informative presentation. I'd like to ask is, I was fascinated to hear that there were 3 distinct classes in pre-war Greeks here in Australia.
And I'm just more intense than it is today, I think.
And I'm just wondering, those that were doing it really tough, how did they survive especially during the Depression years? And my second question is, when talking to pre-war Greeks here in Australia, I quite often found that they were talking, or they were reminiscing actually, about a very happy period for them, and they sort of idolized it, and they never spoke about those 3 distinct classes. And I'm just wondering, was there mass amnesia there? What was happening?
Yeah, well, you see that always is a subjective element there. And the other thing is that many people, when they look back, they look with some nostalgia. But it's not always as simple as that. I had a talk before 2000 with George. He has died now. He was here since 1929. He was secretary of the Greek community here. He was the secretary. And he remembers some things with nostalgia. He thought some things with nostalgia. But on the other hand, saying that in 1933, many lost their business. Many lost their jobs. Many lost their houses. And what could they do after that? They could rent if they could. And it was, he said, in the 1950s, many of those people who lost their houses, they were not going to the bank to take a loan to buy a house, because they were thinking that a Great Depression might come again and they might lose their houses. So they preferred to live in rent rather than buying a house. This was said by the same man who was said, oh, those were good years. But you see that there was another side to it. So it's, there are many details in every story.
And just 2 more we can fit in. This gentleman here and just right down the front. And...
Όταν ήρθα στην Αυστραλία, δεν τον γνώριζα, sorry που μιλάω ελληνικά, καταλαβαίνουμε νομίζω όλοι. Τον κύριο Φίφη δεν τον γνώριζα, τον γνώρισα σε μια συνάντηση στο Δημόκριτο που είχαμε με τον Πλούταρχο του Δελιγιάννη Εγώ λέω, είχε έρθει η συζήτηση για τον Χρήστο Φίφη και λέει ο Βεδελιγιάννης είναι ένας πολύ εργατικότατος άνθρωπος διανοούμενος. Αργότερα το επιβεβαίωσα αυτό όταν τον είχα και καθηγητή στο Victoria College. Θα προσθέσω εδώ, εκτός από το εργατικότατος διανοούμενος, είναι και ανιδιοτελής και όλοι το γνωρίζουμε αυτό από την προσφορά του στην ελληνική παροικία. Ενδιαφέρον είναι που στο βιβλίο αναφέρεται ότι στους εργατικούς συνδέσμους ήταν άτομα πολύ δραστήρια και πολύ committed, όπως αναφέρατε, στην ιδεολογία της αριστεράς και σε αυτό που πρεσβεύανε. Και νομίζω ότι εκείνη την εποχή τέθηκαν οι βάσεις για το κίνημα που δημιουργήθηκε αργότερα να ενταχθούν οι Έλληνες της μαζικής μετανάστευσης στα εργατικά συνδικάτα και στο πώς ψήφιζαν, ενώ ερχόταν δεξιοί από την Ελλάδα, εδώ ψήφιζαν όχι δεξιά. Και φτάσανε στο σημείο να ντρέπονται ιδιαίτερα αυτοί που ήταν liberal, οι λίγοι που ήτανε, να ντρέπονται να λένε ότι ψηφίζουν liberal και αυτό νομίζω ισχύει μέχρι και σήμερα. Ευχαριστώ.
Ναι, να πω κάτι εδώ, είναι ότι αυτό είναι πολύ σωστό. Τώρα, μπορώ να πούμε ότι μέχρι τα μέσα της δεκαετίας του 70, μέχρι το 1973 ας πούμε, 1974, πολλοί δεξιοί ήταν φανατικοί. Υπήρχε αυτός ο διαχωρισμός δεξιών και αριστερών. Μετά την πτώση της Χούντας όμως, άρχισαν τα πράγματα να αλλάζουν λίγο, βαθμιδών. Μπορούμε να δούμε πώς ήταν. Ο νέος κόσμος τότε ήταν η εφημερίδα της αριστεράς. Έτσι, σιγά σιγά άρχισε να γίνεται μέλος του καταστημένου. Τώρα σήμερα το καταστημένο είναι και δεξιοί και αριστεροί. Δεν είναι, αλλά υπάρχει ένα συνοθήλευμα κάπως. Δεν είναι τόσο χωριστά όπως ήταν τότε.
Thank you very much. James Samagis is my name. My father was from a village outside Florina and came to Perth in 1951 and he was 16. But I really just wanted to make a comment. Thank you firstly for the photographs. I thought to see the children outside the Evangelismos Church was very nice. So I just thought for an extra perspective, I was very moved some years ago when I saw some paintings by Russell Drysdale, and he painted Joe and Maria in 1950 in a cafe that seemed to be out in the outback, a sort of red dust sort of location. And I just thought that might make an interesting extra number of slides for you, because they're now paintings in the Australian canon of art. And once again, you sort of see Greeks in a way being put in a classic form or, you know, admired for their hard work. So I'd recommend to everyone look at these paintings of Joe and Maria, and I think they're from Kithera, and it's a series of paintings from 1950. Thank you.
I'm sorry we can't take any more questions, but Dr. Fifis said that he'd be happy to keep chatting afterwards. For a spell. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. It's been a great turnout and we're happy to be back in the centre and coming down and being together again. Next week we've got Dr. Stavroula Nikolaidis, who's here with us tonight, and she's going to be presenting with Professor James Walker, and the talk is going to be on Greek in Melbourne, language, identity and belonging. So please come along, same time next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Oh, thank you. Thanks very much.
We're going to have part two, I think, of this talk, because from 1954 onwards.
Γεια σου, Βάσο. Ω, Βάσο.